They were America's perfect Christian family. 19 children, a $25 million media empire, and a hit show that defined wholesome TV for a decade. We watched them build their big house, celebrate modest courtships, and preach family values to millions of households. But behind the 18-inch hair and floor-length skirts lay a high-security psychological prison. This wasn't a reality show. It was a $400,000 per episode human trafficking operation disguised as faith. While the world saw a blessing, the Duggar children were living in a nightmare where their primary predator shared their last name, and their father was the one signing the NDAs to keep him there. Today we peel back the modesty to reveal the 20-year timeline of police cover-ups, the $0 bank accounts of the exploited stars, and the dark truth TLC spent millions to bury. The image etched into the American psyche was one of pristine pastoral perfection. 19 children with synchronized smiles, floor-length denim skirts, and a patriarch who seemed to have found the secret to a blessed life. But every monument to godly values in Tontitown, Arkansas was built on a foundation of calculated trauma and a ruthless financial machinery. To understand the collapse of the Duggar empire, we must first look at the man who drafted the blueprints for this high-stakes psychological prison, Jim Bob Duggar. He didn't just build a family, he engineered a $25 million. Before the cameras arrived, the Duggars weren't a symbol of abundance. They were a portrait of desperation. In the early years, Jim Bob and Michelle lived in the suffocating grip of poverty, surviving on government assistance, food stamps, and the literal bones of a dying local economy. They dressed their growing brood in stained secondhand clothes from thrift stores where $5 had to clothe 3 children. This wasn't a choice. It was a struggle for survival that left a permanent scar on Jim Bob's psyche. It was during this period of scarcity that the first tear was weaponized. Following the birth of their first son, Josh, Michelle became pregnant again, but suffered a devastating miscarriage. They named the lost child Caleb. In the hollowed-out silence of that loss, Jim Bob didn't just mourn, he looked for a culprit. Under the influence of radical patriarchal teachings, the tragedy of Caleb was reframed not as a medical misfortune, but as a divine punishment for Michelle using oral contraceptives. This moment of profound grief became the architect's greatest tool of control. Jim Bob used that guilt to strip Michelle of her autonomy, turning her womb into a factory for the quiverful movement. As Bill Gothard, the disgraced leader of the IBLP, famously preached, "Absolute obedience to the Father is the only path to heaven." For Michelle, this meant a scandal of medical negligence being forced into a cycle of hyperpregnancy that ignored the skyrocketing risks of preeclampsia and uterine rupture. Every birth was a gamble with her life, yet Jim Bob viewed each new child as another arrow in his political and financial quiver. The transition from struggling believers to media moguls was paved with cold, hard dollars. When TLC saw the ratings potential of a so-called freak show family with 14, then 17, and eventually 19 children, they didn't just film a documentary, they built an entire profit machine around faith-based programming. At its peak, the network was reportedly cutting checks ranging from $25,000 to $40,000 per episode. Over more than a decade of filming, the total revenue generated by the Duggar brand exceeded $25,000,000. However, the dollars never trickled down to the children who were the literal labor force of the show. While the world watched 19 kids and counting on their living room TVs, the Duggar children were working 14 to 16-hour days. They were the actors, the crew, the cleaners, and the promotional tools. Yet as they reached adulthood, they discovered a horrifying truth: their bank accounts held $0. Jim Bob had funneled every cent of the millions earned through a shadow company appropriately named Mad Family Inc. He wasn't just a father. He was a CEO who owned his employees by birthright. As Jill Duggar would later recount in her harrowing memoir, "I realized I had been working for free for 10 years while my father sat on millions of dollars." The complicity of the media cannot be understated. TLC executives watched from behind their monitors as children as young as 5 were directed to perform for the lens, ignoring the red flags of exhaustion and the eerie cult-like blank stares of the siblings. The rating gold was too addictive to stop. A former TLC staffer admitted in a whispered confession, "We knew something was wrong. We saw the control, the lack of privacy, the way Jim Bob hovered over every conversation. But the numbers were too high to pull the plug." Jim Bob Duggar stood at the center of this web, maintaining a godly smile while signing non-disclosure agreements, NDAs that functioned as muzzles for his own flesh and blood. He once claimed, "We don't do it for the money, we do it to spread the gospel." But the gospel of Jim Bob Duggar was one of total subjugation. He had successfully turned his family's poverty into a fortune and their private tragedies into a public spectacle. He was the architect of a system where faith was the bait and the children were the catch, trapped in a multi-million-dollar modesty prison where the only way out was to lose everything. As we peel back the layers, the godly facade begins to crack. The $25 million wasn't a blessing. It was the hush money of a patriarch who knew that as long as the checks kept clearing, the dark truth of what was happening in the big house would stay buried. But bones have a way of rising to the surface, and the blood of exploitation eventually cries out from the ground. The architect thought he was building a dynasty. In reality, he was building a tomb. The horror began in the early 2000s, long before the reality TV cameras turned the Duggars into a household name. The victims were not strangers. They were 4 of Josh's younger sisters, some as young as 5 years old. For nearly a decade, these crimes remained a whispered ghost within the Duggar walls. The tears. Here are quantifiable 48 months of repeated unpunished trauma for girls whose sense of safety was permanently shattered before they even reached puberty. Instead of the sterile, safe environment of a licensed therapist, these young girls were subjected to theological interrogation. Jim Bob Duggar did not call the police. He did not seek medical help. Instead, he chose a path of financial and spiritual insulation. In 2003, as the first ripples of the truth began to leak into their social circle, Jim Bob utilized the family's growing wealth to purchase silence. He spent thousands of dollars to send Josh to a sect-run training center, a sham rehabilitation program operated by the IBLP that lacked any licensed psychological oversight. It was a calculated investment to protect the golden boy who was the face of the family's rising fame. The price of this cover-up was paid by the sisters who were forced to sit across the dinner table from their predator every night, instructed by their parents that bitterness was a sin and that forgiveness was a requirement for their salvation. The network of complicity extended far beyond the family home, reaching the very institutions designed to protect the vulnerable. The Springdale Police Department received a formal report in 2006 detailing the graphic nature of the abuse. The official 2006 police report recorded a chilling reality. The victim was visibly trembling while describing what her brother had done to her while their parents were asleep. Yet the wheels of justice ground to a halt. The file was placed in a drawer where it was allowed to sleep for nearly 10 years. No charges were filed. No investigation was pursued. The local authorities, enamored by the family's celebrity and political clout, allowed a predator to walk free in a house full of minors. Among the shadows, one voice dared to scream. Alice, a close family friend, became the primary whistleblower. She was the one who realized that the godly family was in fact a crime scene. But in the world of the Duggars, truth is treated as treason. Alice was swiftly isolated, branded as a troublemaker, and cut off from the community. Her attempt to bring justice was met with a wall of psychological warfare, proving that in this empire, loyalty to the patriarch was the only currency that mattered. As Josh grew older, his crimes were not just buried, they were politically shielded. Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas and a powerful presidential candidate, became a vocal defender of the family. To the political elite, the Duggars represented hundreds of thousands of evangelical votes. When the scandal finally broke in 2015, Huckabee and others provided a moral cloak for Josh, framing the serial abuse as a youthful indiscretion rather than a predatory pattern. But the most cold-blooded calculation happened in the boardroom of TLC, when the 2006 police report was finally leaked by the media. In 2015, the network faced a financial apocalypse. Within weeks, TLC hemorrhaged an estimated $19,000,000 in lost advertising revenue as blue-chip sponsors fled the 19 Kids and Counting brand. The show was canceled, but the dollars did not stop flowing for long. In a move that defined corporate sociopathy, the network and Jim Bob engineered a spin-off, Counting On. The cruel irony was staggering. To recover the $19 million lost, the network put the victims back on screen. The sisters who had been traumatized by their brother and then silenced by their father were now the primary breadwinners. They were forced to discuss their own victimization on camera to keep the family empire afloat. As Jessa Duggar poignantly stated, "We were victims twice, once by our brother and once by the media." Through it all, the architect Jim Bob remained the enforcer. When his daughters wavered, when the weight of the charade became too much to bear, he didn't offer comfort. He offered a threat. He reportedly told his daughters, "If this gets out, we lose everything. Do you want your family living on the streets?" This was the $0 justice. The victims were blackmailed into silence by the very man who was supposed to protect them, while the predator Josh Duggar was given a platform, a marriage to the submissive Anna Duggar, and a high-ranking job at a conservative lobbyist group. The family had traded the souls of their daughters for a $25 million television contract, proving that in the dark reality of Hollywood faith, the only thing more sacred than the Bible was the bottom line. As Josh himself claimed in his 2015 public apology, "I acted inexcusably, but I have found redemption." For the public, it was a soundbite. For his victims, it was a life sentence of trauma. The image of the golden boy is shattered, replaced by the profile of a monster who was fed and protected by a system of corporate greed and patriarchal blackmail. The playroom was never a place of innocence. It was a hunting ground where the screams were drowned out by the sound of cashing checks. But the 2015 explosion was only the beginning. The predator was still hungry, and the next chapter of his crimes would involve a darkness so deep, even the millions of TLC could no longer hide it. In the theological landscape of the Institute in Basic Life Principles (IBLP), there is a diagram known as the umbrella of protection. At the very top sits God, then the husband, then the wife, and finally the children. To stay under the umbrella is to be safe. To step out is to invite the storms of Satan. But for Jill Duggar, the family's golden daughter, the umbrella wasn't a shield, it was a cage of architectural entrapment. In this third chapter of the Duggar collapse, we strip away the spiritual rhetoric to reveal a brutal reality of financial slavery and psychological warfare, where a father's blessing carried a price tag of absolute subjugation. The tears of this chapter are shed by Jill Duggar, the first of the siblings to realize that her life was being auctioned off one episode at a time. The exploitation reached a fever pitch in the weeks leading up to her 2014 wedding to Derek Dillard. While the world saw a blushing bride preparing for a godly courtship, Jill was being cornered in the family's office. Jim Bob, acting more like a cutthroat talent agent than a father, presented her with a massive pile of paperwork. Exhausted, overwhelmed by the pressure of a televised wedding and conditioned from birth never to question the patriarch Jill signed. She didn't know she was signing a 5-year ironclad extension to her contract with TLC, a blood oath that ensured her labor belonged to her father well into her married life. The true cruelty of this umbrella was exposed through a medical crisis. When Jill went into labor with her first son Israel, the perfect home birth turned into a 70-hour nightmare ending in an emergency C-section. She suffered significant blood loss and trauma. The hospital bill arrived shortly after, totaling tens of thousands of dollars. This was the moment the illusion shattered. Despite being the star of a show that generated millions for the network and her father, Jill found herself buried in medical debt she couldn't pay. When she turned to Jim Bob for help, expecting her fair share of the show's profits to cover the cost of her son's birth, the answer was a cold, resounding no. The patriarch who preached family values refused to pay for the medical emergency of the daughter whose birth he had sold for ratings. The transition from struggling believers to media moguls was paved with cold, hard dollars. When TLC saw the ratings potential of a so-called freak show family with 14, then 17, and eventually 19 children, they didn't just film a documentary, they built an entire profit machine around faith-based programming. At its peak, the network was reportedly cutting checks ranging from $25,000 to $40,000 per episode. Over more than a decade of filming, the total revenue generated by the Duggar brand exceeded $25,000,000. This system of repression required a network of enforcers and victims. Michelle Duggar served as the spiritual buffer, frequently reminding her daughters that wealth is God's blessing for obedience. In Michelle's world, to ask for a paycheck was to display a spirit of rebellion. Meanwhile, Anna Duggar, the wife of the predator Josh, stood as a haunting foil to Jill. Anna remained trapped under the umbrella, a model of blind endurance, forced to stay with an unrepentant abuser because her financial and spiritual autonomy had been systematically erased. Anna was the warning. Jill was the escapee. The rebellion was sparked by Derek Dillard. As an outsider with an accounting background, Derek began asking the one question Jim Bob feared most: where is the money? Derek's refusal to bow to the patriarch turned him into a pariah. Jim Bob didn't just exclude them from the family, he weaponized the legal system. The Holt family, longtime friends of the Duggars who had witnessed the internal rot, found themselves caught in the crossfire of Jim Bob's legal aggression as he moved to sue and intimidate anyone who dared to support Jill and Derek's quest for transparency. When Jill and Derek finally took legal action to recover her earnings, the response from the Duggar camp was a masterclass in corporate coldness. The Duggar family lawyer stated with clinical detachment, "A signed contract is a valid contract regardless of whether the parties involved are father and daughter." This was the ultimate admission in the big house. Blood was not thicker than water, it was thinner than ink. After years of legal battles and being effectively exiled from her family, Jill received a settlement of $175,000. To the average person, that might sound like a significant sum. But when measured against the $25 million empire built in part on her participation and the decade of her life spent under relentless studio lights, it becomes far less substantial. Critics have described it as little more than hush money framed as a settlement, a payout that raises difficult questions about a system where a father effectively turned his children's private lives into televised content for profit. Jill Duggar's journey from the submissive golden daughter to a whistleblower is a testament to the high cost of freedom. She traded her inheritance and her family's approval for the right to own her own story. But as the umbrella of repression began to leak, the ultimate storm was gathering. The financial bickering was about to be overshadowed by a federal investigation that would bring the FBI to the Duggars' doorstep, proving that while you can buy silence with $175,000, you cannot buy your way out of a criminal forensic trail. The digital footprints of a predator leaves a trail that no amount of godly reputation can erase. In November 2019, the high-security walls Jim Bob Duggar built around his empire finally collapsed under the weight of a federal warrant. When FBI agents raided Josh Duggar's used car lot wholesale motor cars, they weren't looking for financial discrepancies or television contracts. They were looking for a monster. What they found on a partitioned Linux drive was a darkness so profound it would permanently sever the Duggars from the American public. Over 200 files of the most vile child sexual abuse material CSAM imaginable. The tears in this final act are not shed for the perpetrator, but for the collateral damage of a broken system. Inside the courtroom, the most haunting image was that of Anna Duggar. Her hollowed-out, vacant expression as she walked into the courthouse every day became a living testament to the destructive power of the IBLP cult. She was a woman groomed from birth to stand by her man even when that man was a convicted serial predator. Her silence was a scream for a life stolen by indoctrination. Simultaneously, the family was fracturing beyond repair. Jinger Duggar, once the obedient daughter, had fled to Los Angeles, trading the big house for a life of autonomy. In her groundbreaking book, she finally spoke the truth that millions had suspected. Our life was not a song of hope. It was a maze of fear. The process of justice was clinical and unyielding, spearheaded by Tom fan Timothy L. Brooks. Unlike the local authorities in 2006, Judge Brooks was immune to the Duggar charm and the blessings of their political connections. He saw through the layers of deception and the family's attempts to frame Josh as a victim of a government setup. In a moment of searing moral clarity, Judge Brooks delivered a verbal execution of Josh's character, stating, "You have participated in some of the darkest crimes that a human being can imagine." The dollars of the final fall represent the total bankruptcy of a brand. The Golden Boy was not just a son, he was the primary investment of the Duggar Corporation. His conviction for the possession and receipt of CSAM brought a definitive end to the TLC cash flow. The network, having already lost $19 million in 2015, finally pulled the plug on the entire franchise forever. The Big House, the 7,000 square foot monument to family values, began to transform into a spiritual tombstone. With the cameras gone and the contracts terminated, the tens of millions of dollars in future earnings evaporated overnight. Jim Bob Duggar, the architect who believed his wealth could buy permanent immunity, faced his own public execution at the ballot box. In a desperate attempt to regain power, he ran for a seat in the Arkansas State Senate during the peak of Josh's trial. The result was a humiliating death blow to his reputation. He received a mere 15% of the vote. The public had finally spoken. The Duggar name, once a golden ticket in conservative politics, was now toxic. The final math of the Duggar legacy is a cold set of figures: 151 months over 12 years in federal prison for Josh Duggar, a $50,000 fine, a lifetime on the sex offender registry, and the permanent dissolution of a $25 million media empire. As Josh was led away in handcuffs, his cousin Amy Duggar spoke for the survivors of the family's decades of gaslighting. Finally, justice has knocked on the door. Money can no longer buy silence. Even in the face of total ruin, the patriarch refused to break character. After the sentencing, Jim Bob Duggar stood outside the ruins of his reputation and once again retreated into the language of the umbrella of protection, stating, "We are heartbroken, but we trust in the fairness of God." It was a final desperate attempt to use religion as a shield against the consequences of his own complicity. Today, the Big House in Tontitown stands as a silent witness to the danger of unmonitored power. The children who once filled its hallways with rehearsed laughter are scattered, some seeking healing in exile, others still trapped in the psychological prison of their upbringing. The $25 million is gone, replaced by legal fees and the cost of a ruined name. The Duggars didn't just lose a show, they lost the right to be believed. In the end, the perfect Christian family was exposed as a multi-million-dollar human trafficking operation where the only thing godly was the profit margin. The Golden Boy is now just federal inmate hash 05705-509. The cameras have stopped rolling, the lights have dimmed, and the only thing left is the truth. A truth that didn't cost millions to tell, but cost a family their souls to hide.